We're spending $15 million an episode.
Okay, good. Hello, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Hello to everyone online. I'm Eric Gross. I'm the co-founder of the Tech Academy. Thank you very, very much for arriving here. It's my pleasure to introduce a good friend, Jason Aden. He's a front-end developer at Google and actually works on tools that front-end developers use. He's got a pretty great story about his origin in the industry, how he arrived at where he's at, and is free for Q&A afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Jason Aden.
Thanks, guys. So, like you said, Jason Aden. I've been at Google for about 2 years now. I work on Project Angular. This is the logo. Anybody?
That's not the Avengers logo?
No, not the Avengers logo.
Oh, okay.
My kids think it's an A shield for my last name, Aden. So they're happy when they get to wear their Angular shirts. Anybody heard of Angular? Used Angular? A few? Okay. Well, I think what we'll do is sort of go into my background and how I got started first, and then we can talk a little bit about Google, and then we can get into questions if anybody has questions about Google. How do you get there? How do you get to big tech companies if you're interested in going to big tech companies? So I started with software development back in 1999, which was, for anybody that was around then, the pre-dot-com bubble burst. That burst about a year after I started in the tech industry. And I was, at the time, working for a .com called HR.com. And it was fun. I was learning a lot. I kind of was learning on the job at the time. And they were looking at getting bought out for a lot of money. And then the bubble burst. All their offers dried up. All my work went away. So I ended up transitioning from there into doing a lot of work for federal government. I moved to the Washington, D.C. area. The federal government always has work. They're always developing something. They're always spending money. So I did a lot of work for places like NASA and Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and eventually I spent about 4 years working at the State Department. And at the State Department, I think I really ended up honing my skills there. I was working with a couple of really good developers and a host of people that I wouldn't necessarily classify as really good developers. But I just sort of let myself get attached to the guys that I thought were really good. The people that I looked up to, the people that would go into a meeting and express opinions that were difficult to argue with. And I spent a lot of time working with those guys. So while I was there, I worked on a few kind of big systems. They were all internal. But one was a big system for tracking. In the State Department, every embassy in the world is called a mission. Okay, so they have this big system called Mission Activity Tracker. This was my introduction to purely front-end, a purely front-end application, where this was I think we had about 300,000 lines of code that was running in the browser. Handwritten code from the browser, and then we had a whole bunch of back-end code for tracking what embassies were doing out in the world and what effect their programs would have on the image of the United States. Basically, it was a big, expensive system that was designed to justify tax dollars being spent on programs in foreign countries. That's actually what it was when it comes down to it. Later, so I worked on that. That was my introduction to sort of the front end. I was doing both front and back end at the time. Later, I moved into another area that was we had 7 applications that all had somewhat similar data sets. And I spent about 18 months working on a big project to take all 7 of these applications and take all their data and their databases and put everything into one, right? So it was a lot of work. It was in Oracle. If anybody's used Oracle, there's good things and there's bad things. So I spent a lot of time in SQL. We didn't have some of the same tools that are available now for doing transfers between systems. Some of them were kind of coming out and were new. We just wrote a ridiculous amount of SQL. Anyway, that was about an 18-month project there. By the end of it, I was one of the leads on the project. And then afterwards, the task was, now that all the data was in one place, or it could be in one place, the task was convert each one of these 7 applications to use the new data source. Right? So I was responsible for about 3 of those applications and brought that through to a completion. Looking around the State Department, there were a lot of people who had been there for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and I felt like their skills were kind of going stale. Right, the world of technology moves pretty fast, and if these guys have been working on single applications for one guy was there for like 12 years working on one application. He wrote most of the code for an application that was 1.2 million lines. He was theoretically the only guy that could maintain it, right? It's good for job security until they replace that application, right? At which point your skills are 10 years out of date. So looking around seeing that, I started doing sort of some side work. I did some contracting. I worked on a startup for a while, sort of in my spare time. In the meantime, I was having a bunch of kids, so the spare time was diminishing quickly. I currently have four kids, but I spent time. I did some projects for. I did a project for Claire's. Anybody have girls? Anybody seen Claire's in the malls? Yeah. So I did a little project for them, which was a project where you would take your photo and upload it to Claire's, and purely in the front end, we would basically take that photo, crop it, and add things like earrings or lipstick or necklaces to the photo, and then you could print it off and go to the store and say, hey, I want all these things because they look good on me. During that time, I worked on a little startup, which is a personal tracking system. We called it Me. And it was I think it was my introduction to mobile development. I started, that was when I transitioned over from Windows to Mac. I started doing a little bit of iOS development. And then, I'm just going to look at some of my notes here. So at the end of 2014, I had used a number of different front-end technologies. I consider myself a full stack developer. So I did database side, I did the server side, and I did the front-end side. But in 2012, somebody reached out to me based on my LinkedIn profile. I went to go work for a company called Catalina Marketing. They're down in St. Petersburg, Florida. And so I moved down there for what was going to be probably a 1-year contract, ended up being a couple of years. And the first task on this project was determine what framework, what software system to use to build this new piece of software that they needed. So myself and one other engineer on the project spent about 6 weeks evaluating 22 different frameworks, and we would kind of pare down the list, and then we would spend a day or two in each framework building a mini application to see how it felt. Right? This was right around the time that AngularJS first came out. It was brand new. We decided to use it, and so I spent the next 2 years building an application for Catalina Marketing. They're a they would call themselves kind of a big data company. They're the guys that if you go into a supermarket and you slide your card at checkout, you get a coupon that gets printed that most people just throw away, right, or you don't even look at. Okay, Catalina Marketing is printing those coupons. But they actually know, they have data on about 83% of the population of the US. They have purchase history on about that amount of people. It's a lot. So this system was a system where they could develop marketing campaigns, somewhat similar to, say, a Google AdWords, where you say, I want women of this age and people that are interested in soft drinks, right? If they're marketing for Coke, they'll find the subset of people that are interested in the soft drinks, or maybe Pepsi purchasers, because Coke wants to market to Pepsi purchasers, try to convert them. So it was basically a system to put together these marketing campaigns. I worked on that for about 2 years. And after that, anybody heard of the company Salesforce? Okay, anybody used Salesforce? I haven't actually used it, but I worked for them. So after Catalina Marketing in 2014, and after spending a couple of years with this new framework, AngularJS at the time, I moved to Salesforce, which is a company in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. Pretty big publicly traded company. They have a whole bunch of different products, and they had purchased another company called Desk.com. And Desk.com is a customer service and support system. So I was brought in to help the team that was rebuilding, building an entirely new support client. So I spent about 2 years working on that for Salesforce, and we had 60,000 clients with anywhere between, a client would be anywhere between like a 3-user seat to up to, I think our biggest ones that we supported was like 350 users, right? And then after that, they would go to a bigger system. So we had a lot of users. I got real exposure to pretty heavily trafficked, publicly facing, application that, with service level agreements, and if issues would come up, they're on fire, right? People's work is actually affected. After that, I ended up transitioning over to Google. So Google reached out to me in 2013 or 2014. Started the interview process there. The interview process for Google is very long, somewhat notoriously long. Starts with a couple of phone interviews. If you get through the phone interviews, you go see them down at Mountain View. You do a day of interviews. You do about 5 interviews in person in Mountain View, and then there's a whole process after the interviews to determine, are they going to give you an offer? And then once you get an offer, once they determine we're going to give you an offer, they have a whole other team that determines what the offer is, right? So it's a somewhat long process. I think it took me about 4 months to kind of work through that process. And I started Google in July 2016. I started Google Fiber. I think here in Portland, you guys know about Fiber, right?
Yeah.
I think Fiber pulled out, right? Of Portland?
Yeah.
Pretty sure. Yeah.
1 gigabit per second.
Yeah. So it's a gigabit per second synchronous upload and download speed, right? And I think it started in like Kansas City. I was building tools for the people that were planning the rollout of fiber into different cities. But I don't know. I don't remember if fiber is still in Portland. I left fiber about 6 months after I started because they decided to scale back the deployment of fiber, right? I think there were a lot of cities that were disappointed. I don't remember if Portland was one where they're continuing or not. So yeah, about 6 months later, after I started at Google, fiber was starting to ramp down, and I wanted to find a new project. Having worked in Angular and AngularJS for the prior 4 or 5 years, I reached out to that team. Got super lucky that they had some openings, and so about 1.5 years ago, transitioned over to the Angular team. And Angular is a large open source project. I was going to just sort of take a look here. We've got about 40,000 stars on GitHub, and about 9,000 people have forked Angular, right? Which means they're taking our source and making their own version of it. Maybe they're contributing back to it. Our documentation site gets something like 1.2 million unique users a month, and there's a lot of developers around the world that use the framework, so we're kind of constantly trying to improve it, come out with new versions. We just released version 6 about a week ago. Yes, part of my responsibilities there are development on the framework, as well as, you know, each team member goes out and does like talks at conferences and stuff. So we've got a big conference dedicated to the Angular framework that just finished in April. We've got another one over in London. I'm going to go to London later this year, do a talk at a big Angular conference out there. And that is, I think, my really quick story. So first, let me just see. Anybody have any immediate questions? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, in your day-to-day work, how do you build and maintain and improve a framework? You know, what kind of tasks do you work on?
So we do an Agile development methodology, right? So every day we do a stand-up at 11 in the morning. You know, we plan out tasks for the week. There's two ways that we get tasks in. One would be GitHub, right? People submit a lot of issues on GitHub, and you know, if there's something like a regret, sometimes we put out new code and we push a regression, right? So regressions are pretty important to us. We have to kind of drop everything, fix the regression, and put a fix back out.
Is a regression, sorry, is that
Oh.
reverting back to an earlier?
Say like an example would be, Angular has some, I don't know, there's things like a button component, right? And the button has a nice little animation when you click it. It sort of goes, you know, it like comes out from where you clicked, and this little shadow kind of goes flip on it, okay? A regression would be you push something that breaks that animation. Now, everybody that pulls in the new code around the world, their buttons don't look right, you know? So that's a regression. It's something that used to work that now you've broken.
Under certain circumstances.
Yes, under circumstances, but theoretically it's anything that used to work. And if it breaks 2% of people, it's still 2% of people that are broken, right? So we have to hurry up and fix that.
So there's flavors of Angular, and then there's versions. So what part do you work on?
Sorry, you said there's flavors?
Well, I mean, there's
AngularJS and Angular?
there's Angular.
Okay.
There's I was saying qualitatively Angular 1 or 2 is very different
They're
than
very
the
different.
Angular 3, right? And
Okay,
then
so Angular 1, so when I first started using Angular, it was AngularJS,
Yeah.
and that was Angular 1.
Yeah.
It was Angular 1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 5, 6, and right now there's an Angular 1.7, AngularJS 1.7. That is a completely different code base than the one that I work on, which is Angular, which started at version 2 and is currently at version 6. They're just two very different frameworks, and so the original one is called AngularJS, and the new one is called Angular. They just dropped the JS part. Yeah, so I work on that part, the new one. Yeah.
Are there a few popular examples of where we can see Angular in work and use?
Yeah, I think. I mean, if you were ever to use something like Google AdWords, the entirety of Google AdWords is written in Angular. If you go to like Google Shopping Express, that's all written in Angular. There's something like 900 projects in Google that are written in Angular. Some of them are publicly facing and a lot are internal, but those would be two. You wouldn't tend to use something like Angular for, say, a news site, right? You would tend to use it for something more like a shopping express, where you're browsing a catalog of things, you're adding something to a cart, you're doing checkout, things like that. For things like a news site, you need something that is, Angular can produce very dynamic content, right? It can produce things that that change on the fly. Maybe they react to the user hovering over something. They have animated transitions between pages, things like that. Things like a news site has to be optimized for just static content that won't change until you, as an editor, push a change to it, right? So Angular's good for that stuff. More dynamic stuff. Yeah.
How many people would you say you work with on like a daily basis? Like when you do that sit down at the beginning of the day, how many people are you talking about?
We've got so on the Angular team, it's something like about 22. And what we do is we do a smaller stand up that then rolls up, because 22 is way too many for a stand up, right? You're gonna be there for too long. So we do a small stand up, and then that rolls up to the bigger stand up. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're biased on this question, but what would you have to say about choosing a framework to use and learn to use versus like Angular versus React and Vue and some of these other frameworks?
I'm not biased.
No?
So his question's about, there's a lot of choices for frameworks when you're talking about, the front-end landscape. These are front-end frameworks. The front-end landscape has been advancing very quickly for a number of years, and even some very pretty brand new frameworks, things like Vue, have gained a lot of popularity very quickly. So how would you go about choosing one? I think the best way to go about choosing it is to actually do some work in each framework that you're interested in using, right? I think Angular tends to be very good for larger projects, larger teams, for team collaboration. It's also a framework that gives you everything out of the box, right? You have the ability to render things on screen. You have things like animations. You have things like routing between parts of your application. Frameworks like React is for sort of the Vue side only, and you have to take other pieces and piece them together to be able to develop an application with it.
Okay, I have a question. So, how do you feel to work in Google compared to your previous employer?
Okay, so how do I feel to work in Google? Google is, I think, a very fun company to work for. It's about to turn 20 years old. I think today, this year, Google turns 20. Anybody know who started Google?
Yeah, Sergey Brin and Larry Page or something.
Yeah, Sergey and Larry. Yeah, two guys, Stanford grads.
Yeah.
Started
graduate? Or did they drop out?
I don't remember. I have to look. I have this on a
They
slide.
just dropped out the PhD.
Yeah, I think they did drop out of the PhD program. They're computer science graduate students.
Yeah, they were.
They didn't drop out of undergrad, in other words.
Yeah.
They not finished their
That was the
PhD
other
degree.
Yeah. And anybody know what the first product was for Google?
Maybe searching.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was search, right? Their big thing was figure out a better way to organize the data, right? And surface it in a new way that other people weren't, right? So yeah, they came out with search. And Google from the very beginning is a company that is, I think, different than a lot of other companies. That was one of the things that when they founded Google, they wanted Google to be different. Think a little bit differently about problems. Don't stay inside the box. Try to be outside the box. Google feels kind of like work, but not really, right? You work with a lot of really, really smart people, and so you learn a lot. And at the same time, they want you to enjoy your time there, right? I think I overheard You talking about something you were down at the campus
Oh yeah.
or something, right?
Yeah, I was on a road trip and I just stopped through the Mountain View.
The Mountain View camp. Yeah.
It was like a playground.
Yes. Yeah. There's a number of different playgrounds. Yeah. There's a lot of playgrounds. There's like a couple of volleyball courts.
Yeah.
Yeah. The colored bicycles. Anybody seen the Internship movie?
Yeah, I was talking about that.
Yeah. So there's these colored bicycles and they're sort of all over the campus. The campus is like the main campus, which is where I work, is about like a mile and a half long one way and about 3/4 of a mile the other way. So, and it's basically all Google in there. It's a whole bunch of different buildings. And so the culture at Google is very much let people have fun, let people experience things that are not just sitting in front of the desk, but also make sure that they get a lot done, right? At Google, you're constantly evaluated on how much you're getting done, right? And how much you're contributing. We're specifically evaluated every 6 months on that. There's a big cycle where you go through a review to see, you list your contributions and then you get input from peers to find out, what do they think about your contributions? Are you contributing enough? Do you need to work on, a different, certain area to be able to contribute more? These things feed into everything, such as your pay, how much of a raise you're going to get, if you're going to get a raise. Yes.
So with respect to that, I know a little bit about Agile. My husband's an Agile coach.
Okay. Yeah.
And one of the issues with Agile is that there are many companies that don't have an Agile rating system, so that they try to make people compete for raises, but not the team, and so they don't understand the team dynamics and how teams are supposed to be working together and self-directed. Does Google have self-directed work teams, or how does that? How does their Agile environment landscape work?
So it doesn't necessarily follow any specific Agile principle. Like a team by team is allowed to decide how they would want to do their development process. If you really wanted to do like a waterfall process, you could.
But
a lot of teams
but
choose
if
an
they're
Agile
deciding,
process.
they're self-directed.
They are, yeah. Teams are very much self-directed. There's no prescribed way of doing anything. There's prescribed ways of writing code and make sure all the code is well written. But in terms of the process of doing development, there isn't a prescribed way. Each team gets to make that decision. When you're going for a performance review, it just relates, as long as you got if you got a lot of things done, you put those in the performance review, right? You put each thing that you got done into your performance review. But you also have to sort of measure yourself and measure others on, they call it Googliness, right? Which would include things like helping others, helping other people in your group, helping other groups within Google. It would also be helping other groups outside of Google, right? I mean, things like doing volunteer time and stuff like that would kind of go into that category. So you're evaluated on a number of different things, and you have to have impact. The thing that you do has to have some level of complexity. It can't just be something that is like super simple to do, right? Which sort of makes sense.
You're an engineer.
Yeah, you're an engineer. It's going to have complexity, and you have to demonstrate that it wasn't something that just anybody could have done. You may have had to research something, figure out some new algorithm, figure out some new way of doing something, and so you would end up documenting that as part of that process. So, yeah.
We're talking about performance review. I mean, you put in what you accomplished in your review, but I think another component is your objectives. So you must have objectives, and then you put your results against those objects. So does those objects come from the top?
They come from the very, very top.
And then
yes. So the objectives always come from the top, and then so for Google specifically, it's Sundar Pichai, right? Who runs Google. Larry runs Alphabet, which is above that, right? So like for me, it comes from theoretically Sundar, but then it trickles down to I'm in the product area called ads, which is a very large product area at Google, right? It makes all the money, which is nice to be in the one that makes the money. So then there's the goals for ads, and then it trickles down from there. There's a software group within ads, which is Angular is really a developer productivity tool, right? Both for Googlers but also outside. As far as the Google goals, it would be related to productivity of Google engineers, right? So our goals are related to the productivity of Google engineers, and then individual teams base their goals on the goals for this group, right? Yes.
So it's maybe a challenge question. If the goal is like increase the Google engineer productivity by 200%, and then do you still have time to play in the playground, or you just like 200% that's a lot, or 300% I have to work day and night try to get this goal?
Well, so I've definitely done that, the work day and night thing. But I think a lot of people in tech do, right? Like, I've always had that every once in a while. When there's a big release coming or something, you put in a lot of time. I know I do over the years. I've put in long hours.
That's what Agile was supposed to help fix. It was supposed to be sustainable development.
Yes. If you were to show me a team that perfectly runs Agile in the long term, I believe that's like a snowflake. Like there's very few of those, right? It's a totally unique thing because I think it's team dependent, it's goals dependent, it's product manager dependent. There's so many pieces to Agile. It's very difficult to run it perfectly, and what perfectly means is going to be different by product and by company. So there are times every once in a while where you have to do that. But that being said, yes, you're judged against goals. You try to set goals that you can meet. We set goals in terms of goals that we definitely want to meet, plus stretch goals. We always set goals that are like 20% or 30% above what we think we might be able to do. And if we can blitz this other stuff, then we go to the stretch goals and try to get that done as well. Yeah.
A few years ago, there was a study that came out about Google and the team dynamics, and one of the conclusions of that was that the most important thing to have a productive team is everyone feeling psychologically safe. Mm-hmm. So that's what we see from the outside. What's it really like?
So give me an example of something you would think would be maybe not psychologically safe.
Everyone rolls their eyes when I come up with an idea.
Okay, good. I believe that Google, it's a very good one. Google is especially careful about things like that. It's not very googly to do that, right? Maybe it doesn't make any sense to you right now. Maybe the person came up with something that's a great idea, right? And if you roll your eyes, like you're gonna just suppress good ideas next time. Even if maybe it wasn't a good idea, but it doesn't matter. You still want people, bringing up ideas, right? If somebody were doing that on a regular, it really doesn't happen. If somebody were doing something like that on a regular basis, that it would come up in that performance review, and they'd have to go talk. They'd have to have a conversation with their manager. Eventually, it would be like an HR issue. Yeah, they're pretty careful about that kind of thing. We go through like 2 weeks of training when you first start at Google.
On Googliness?
On some of it's on Googliness, yes. One of the things that's really driven home is that there are no bad ideas. There's also one of the other things that's driven home is there's a lot of really smart people that you work with, and they talk about imposter syndrome, right? Where, I don't belong here. How could I possibly belong here with all these other smart people? And it's something like 80% of Googlers have imposter syndrome. 80% can't be imposters, right? Too high of a number. So, so one of the ways to combat that is if somebody has a question or they don't understand something, like, you know, new ideas, you don't want to squash new ideas, but you also don't want to squash the ability of people to ask questions even if they're embarrassing, right? Maybe I totally don't understand. Somebody just blurted out some technical thing and everybody's nodding their heads, you know, and you're like, oh, I don't really know what that means. Maybe I'll stay quiet. That is definitely not encouraged at Google, and it's totally okay. They really make a big effort to make it okay to ask questions no matter how silly it seems. So, yeah. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes.
So I just want to know a little more about the decision-making process. So for example, say we are a team.
Mhm.
I come up with idea. That idea is okay. And but for example, eventually we want to maybe put that idea on a backlog or even kill the idea.
Mhm.
Who is the person to, for your experience, in the position to make that decision? Your manager, or it's like we just collectively decide no.
So like anywhere else, I think some of this depends on your manager, right? But if you've got a decent manager and it's a decent idea, one of two things is going to happen. Either it's going to go into a backlog and get prioritized at some point, or the other thing is you might be given like a week to go work on it and prove the idea, right? Almost no work is done at Google without a design for it beforehand, right? So we do a lot of writing up designs for the work that we're going to do. Those designs get reviewed by your peers and typically have to have some sort of approval. Not always, but they at least get reviewed, and people provide comments and they say, you know, hey, this data storage system that you're planning on using is not going to support the 3 million users that you're maybe going to have, right? Why don't you look at something else, right? Or here's this other technology that might solve the problem that you're trying to solve, right? So you get a lot of opinions from others in like comment form. But the main thing is if you can't just describe the idea, a lot of times you're just given time to just go work on it for a compressed amount of time, produce a proof of concept. And then based on that proof of concept, you'll also formulate the idea a little bit better. You'll solidify the idea a little bit better. So, yeah.
So this is kind of as an Angular framework team, the roles that might be on that team might be different than another team. But I wondered how diversified the roles are in teams versus how siloified they are, if you can understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think so. So the Angular team has effectively 5 sub-teams. One is the core, which works on the framework itself. That's the team I'm on. That team is mostly just engineers.
Just engineers.
That piece, that's about 6 of us. There's the component called the CLI, which is like a command line interface for assisting developers. That team is engineers and has a lot of input from like a product manager, right? There's the material design team, which is all about like how to do animations and how to make buttons look and tabs and all these kinds of things. That team has software engineers, also has design as part of it. We have a developer relations team that is totally different. One of our developer relations people is pretty heavy on the software engineering side. One is relatively heavy on the software engineering side, but also a very good speaker. He goes out and evangelizes on Angular. And then Angular is built on TypeScript. It's written with the language called TypeScript. And so our team owns TypeScript for Google. Like we own the usage of TypeScript inside of Google. And so there's a lot of work that's done by that team, which is almost completely internal to Google.
TypeScript's a big deal.
TypeScript's a big deal, yes.
Yeah, my question's about GitHub and Git in general.
Sure.
Because you guys work on multiple repos, or how do you handle like private branches and trying to merge that into the public repo because it's open source? Working on a new feature, how do you get that in without multiple repos?
Okay, so each developer on Angular develops Angular the same way as one of you would, which is we go to GitHub and we fork it. So we have our own fork. So I have, github.com/jasonaden/Angular, and my branches would be on there. So I will develop on there, push a branch up there, and then when I want to merge it, I have to create a PR just like everybody else. So I have to create a pull request back to the main repository, and then that goes through the same review process as everybody else's, right?
But then some of your code is public before it's ready.
We almost never hide code
Okay.
from public. There's one thing that is currently being worked on, which is a rewrite of the rendering engine for Angular, and for about 3 months that was kept private,
It's like locally.
just in a private repo somewhere. Yeah, it was just a password protected repo. But then it was made public. And it's almost everything is public first. Does anybody here who here writes code? Okay, most. So there's one thing that's relatively unique about Google, which is that everybody heard of how Google does source control? Okay. Most projects, you have a repository for each different project, right? Google has one repository. Just one. So we call it a mono repo. It has the source code for Maps, Search, Gmail, Inbox, Angular,
So is
Google
that-
AdWords.
Is that using repo that you're using?
It is using a custom-built source control system built on top of Perforce.
Okay.
And it is using a custom-built, the way that you actually work on the Google source code is it's using a custom-built system that can effectively mirror the entirety of the repo, right? It's 100 terabytes or something, so you can't download it, right?
So I've worked on the Android OS source at one point.
Yes.
And that was a great big repo that had little Gits projects within it.
Yes,
So
but that's public,
that's-
right? That's
that
an
is
open,
public.
That's an
That
open
part
source
is
project.
public.
Right. So that's an open source project. It will come. I don't know how they do it. For us, we do open source first and then merge it into Google separately. They may do it. They probably do it the same way, like GitHub first, then merge into Google. But because there's only one repo and everybody is basically at head all the time, right? There's, you can start working and within 10 seconds you'll be 300 or 400 commits out of date, right?
Yeah.
It happens very, very, very fast. So so we have the responsibility of the advantage there is when you're making a change, you can run the tests for anybody that depends on your change. Okay. So for Angular, if we want to merge in a new version of Angular from GitHub to Google, we go through and we run like 16,000 tests, right, across Google. If somebody wanted to, I could go in and theoretically check out the source or modify. You don't really check out, but I could go modify the source for, say, Gmail and try to submit it back. It has to get approved. My changes probably wouldn't get approved because they're not on the project, but I theoretically could, right? You can basically take any piece of the Google source code and edit it at any time and try to submit it back.
Does that work because it's all in the same language?
No, it's all in
Different.
completely different languages.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, there's about 10 or so approved languages to use at Google.
The language is independent of source control.
And the language is independent of that. The build system is what allows that to happen. Internally called Bazel, externally called Blade. Oh, sorry, the other way around. internally called Blaze, externally called Bazel, and it's just a system that can basically build anything. So all our C projects, C++, Java projects, Python projects, all of those are built with Blaze, as well as Angular projects, JavaScript, TypeScript. Everything is basically built with the same build system. Yeah.
How tightly controlled is the way that you organize your code? Like, how much do you feel you can express yourself or can't through your code?
That's a good question. So I think it might be a little bit different for the Angular project versus just any project in Google. The Angular project is very public, so we get a lot of opinions very, very quickly. And there's definitely like coding standards, but if you want to introduce something totally new, say you want to go from like an object-oriented style to a functional style, let's say,
Sure.
You can do it. That's okay, right? And then internally, there's probably even more flexibility, I would say. Depends on the project that you're working on, maybe,
Yeah.
and sort of the rules. Again, projects are able to set that kind of controls themselves, so it might be different project to project. But cool. Yeah.
So if your teams are self-directed, what is the role of the manager?
Okay, so management at Google is another thing that's a little bit different than most places. So me as an engineer, right? If in most companies, in a lot of companies that I've worked at before, you kind of move up until you get to a kind of senior position, and then if you want to move up again, you got to go become a manager, and you tend to be like a little bit more hands-off on the code, right? Most of my managers in the past were pretty hands-off in terms of code. At Google, it doesn't happen that way. You can continue to get promoted up as purely a tech person. You don't have to ever manage anybody, theoretically. A lot of people, as they move up, decide to manage a couple of people, maybe because they're in a lead role, and they decide, yeah, I'll go ahead and take on a few people, right? But they don't have to. You can even be a tech lead and not have anybody that you're managing. You're just the lead on the technical side. So they sort of differentiate like technical skill and ability and technical leadership from people management, right? People management would be the guys that can see a salary and can have a discussion about, a pay raise or time off or something like that, right? And they differentiate. Sometimes it's the same person, but it doesn't have to be. Did that answer the question? Or
Not
maybe,
really.
Sorry, what was it? Yeah.
I was talking about, so how is a manager responsible for a product?
Okay.
Or is
that type of
responsibility for product and people, how is that handled?
Okay, so that was sort of the HR side of manager. You will also have a product manager, and a product manager would be the one that would be responsible for driving the decisions about where a certain product goes, right? And for big teams, there's a product management team, right? And they do a lot of like user surveys and all that kind of stuff to feedback in to the product and make product decisions. Yeah.
So you gave the example of the guy at the State Department, I think, who worked on the same thing for 12 years
Yes.
or whatever.
Yes.
With the rate that tech changes, it's changing all the time, it seems like you have to strike a balance between kind of gaining expertise and what you already know and maybe branching out and learning new things.
Yeah.
And it seems like you've managed that pretty well in your career, so I was just wondering if you had perspective on a good way to keep that balance.
So I think for on the early side, I wish I had done this a bit more at the beginning, would be on the early side, move around more. You're learning so much so fast at the beginning, but if you're in one place or one project, it doesn't have to be move companies. It could just be go find another project. But just get exposed to as many different things as possible early on. Nobody likes to see a resume with less than a year ideally at least 18 months, right? Like you don't want to like be known as somebody that just hops jobs too often. But super early on, it actually can be okay. You know, I mean, I worked with a number of people that kind of came up, and I know, you know, those guys that started early and stayed too long, which I was one for a while, didn't get paid what the market, you know, in terms of pay, weren't getting paid what the market demanded, and didn't get enough of a breadth of knowledge. So I think even as you go on, like changing things, changing projects every ideally 2 to 3 years is pretty good. I feel like, you know, going too much longer than that on one project, you just have, depends on the project, you just have to be a little bit careful. Like some of these guys I worked with at State Department were Delphi developers, right? Now, that's a technology that's basically dead, right? Except for applications that still use Delphi. They have no marketable skills other than to a very small number of companies, right? So you just don't want to get stuck in a situation like that. So if you're on front end, I feel like 2 to 3 years is about right. If you're on sort of a back end project, those would tend to be longer running skills. I think spend a little more time.
I think it is kind of well known in Silicon Valley area. People move around very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of your like project progress, does that like higher than average turnover rate impact how you finish your project, or how you make progress in your project? Your team may leave, and the other team may leave, and then you have to onboard 2 new guys.
I think that the higher than average turnover is largely in Silicon Valley is largely for startups, more than like your Facebooks and Googles and you know, Netflix and stuff. I mean, there is turnover there for sure, but I think people stay on those things a little bit longer, and I know it definitely affects the startups quite heavily because it's super expensive to onboard somebody, right? You got to figure it's, you know, onboarding. They have to do signing bonuses down there too, so onboarding process is, you know, very expensive. At least $100,000, $150,000 per person that they bring on, right? Is sort of how they end up calculating it, and then they're really ineffective for 6 months, right? While they like get up to speed on a project. Yeah.
And Jason, and I think since you're starting in 1990, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So and up till now you have moved few companies.
Yeah.
So and also the technology has changed a lot.
Yes.
So in this like a long like time spectrum, how do you like keep yourself like up to the even at the front row of the technology change? So do you have any special way to learn and recharge yourself?
It's a good question. So, you know, who does front end development here? Okay. Who does back end development here? Okay. I think sometimes the resources are a little bit different between the two. You know, nowadays there's a lot of really good online learning sources. It depends if you're a person that learns better through like video and listening and watching or reading, right? Early on for me, it was always just stacks of hard copy books. Well, yeah, just stacks of books. I used to buy a ton of books back in the day. I recently I've bought maybe like 4 books in the last 2 years, right? Because the online resources are really good. So, you know, for me, a lot of the stuff that I'm working on now is open source. So I will, when a new project comes out or something that appears to be interesting, I'll try to go first hit the documentation from the people that wrote the project, and then try to go build something in that technology. You know, building something will tell you whether or not it's a good technology, and you can kind of evaluate from there. And then I use Egghead.io, which is a good video content site. The nice thing about Egghead is they're smaller bites of data, right? Their videos are relatively short, sometimes jam-packed with a lot of stuff in a short amount of time, so you have to rewatch them a couple times. But you don't have to spend 30 hours on it. And then like Pluralsight, you guys have heard of Pluralsight, or maybe not. Pluralsight is a startup in the teaching world. They're sort of unique because they pay content authors by basically they judge the interest level of the people that are watching the content. So the content authors are heavily incentivized to make really good content and keep it up to date because they get paid based on the number of hours that their content gets watched. So so they have some really good content on there. It tends to be longer format. But if you want to sort of stay up to date with some of the new stuff, they'll be about 6 months behind because there's so much. You know, they'll do like a complete course on something, whereas like Egghead might be like 2 months behind some of the new stuff because they'll do these short little bites.
What was that service called again?
Egghead IO and Pluralsight.
Pluralsight. How you spell it?
Pluralsight, Pluralsight, I think. Yeah,
Oh.
or SITE maybe. I don't remember how they spell it, but
We can go Google search that.
yes, Google will tell you. Yeah.
So,
Oh wait, let me just get one right back here because he's
I just had one quick question and one sort of longer one, but the how were you hiring on a contract basis or were you full time
for Google.
for Google?
Full time.
Okay.
Yes.
Do they do contract based hiring or is that because of
Do
the
they-
hiring process so long?
So they do contract based hiring sometimes. There are plenty of contractors there. They'll you know, and I've I'm buddies with a guy who was a contractor for about 1.5 years, recently moved to full time. It depends on the project, right? Our project, we have contractors. The Angular project has some contractors. Most of the people actually all the people in Mountain View are employees, and then we have some remote contractors. But yes, Google does hire contractors. Not a ton in comparison to employees. They prefer to hire employees. So I think Google hires about 300 people a week. That's on average. Like it's a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
But in a lot of roles too, not just.
Oh, a lot of roles. It's probably 60 or 70% software engineering. It's a lot of software engineering. But yes, a wide variety of roles.
Is the contract hiring format, is it like also like a 4-month interview or is it more of like a?
No, that's the advantage of contracts, right? Would be like it can be much quicker. You know, if you have a specific skill and like a friend of mine, he does like 3D game rendering stuff, and there's something on YouTube that uses this. I didn't know about it until he told me about it. So he's a very specific skill. So he was hired as a contractor for that very specific skill, much quicker to get in, and then eventually he went through the interview process, which is a shorter interview process though, because you can use the fact that you've been working with Google for, in his case, like 18 months. You can say, hey, here's all the things that I've done, and you have to do fewer interviews. So yeah. Go.
So I had a question about the user experience.
Mhm.
I understand that it would be different for different projects, but how in the world do a group of engineers work on user experience for their framework product?
For a framework product that's done, we mainly work with our developer advocates to work with developers of the users who are consuming the framework. Right.
But the end user experience is not just the developer, it's the person who is going to be using it.
Okay, so for me, I'm on the core team. My end user is a developer.
I understand.
For something like the material project, material design, which is an implementation of a design scheme that Google came out with and we have one for Angular, their end users are looking at animations and buttons and things that are moving on screen. So they would interact more with users. It's actually the people that design the material design spec. They're always getting to whatever the end user is. As a framework, our end users really are the developers. But when we're implementing something like material design, the end users of material design are people, right? So when you go into YouTube and or the little plus icon, the circle plus icon that's on all the Google apps now, the fab icon or fab button, that's a material design component, and so that was tested by the material design team, the Google material design team. The Angular material design team just implements the spec from that other team.
Okay,
You
so
see what I'm saying?
you don't have a lot of input in the user experience realm at all.
No, because it's really up to the developer who's using Angular to develop a user experience for their users. And because we're a framework, our
I know,
users
but
are
your
developers.
developers have a user experience for using, and certainly framework development can be made easier in lots of different ways.
Yes.
I just want to ask about a little bit from the international perspective.
Mhm.
So I guess, so do you work with Google software engineers in another country, say in India, maybe in I don't know, in Eastern Europe or somewhere else? Do you collaborate with them, and also do you sometimes like outsource a lot of engineers into other countries? Like
Google does not do a lot of. If it's a group of engineers, they're going to be working. Usually, they'll work together on a project, right? It doesn't do the thing where Google doesn't tend to do the thing where you have some big project and the people in the U.S. are architecting it and driving most of it, and then overnight a bunch of work gets done in India or another country, right? They don't really do that. There's offices in those countries, and those people work on projects largely for those areas, right? The requirements when you're developing an application for a place like India are very different than the requirements for a place like the US. So you want engineers over there to be working on the project together and collaborating together to target their market, right? So that's kind of how Google does it. We do have plenty of people we have one person who's over in Germany on our team, but for the most part, everybody's just in the same place for collaboration, just to be able to collaborate better.
So in terms of like a remote score, Google is not.
Google, in terms of remote score, Google is very low on remote score.
Okay.
Contractors can be remote, employees generally are not. Yeah.
You get to travel a lot? Or ever?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes. Being on a public open source project, there's a requirement to travel. We do. Google does like I said, does the sort of work-life balance thing. So like next week we're doing an offsite, a big group offsite to San Diego. It's interesting, I guess. But they said, what do you want to sign up for? Surf lessons. I've never done surfing. Escape room, hiking. There's some like street with a whole bunch of interesting food. We can go tour the street. You just sort of sign up for different stuff that you want to do over the couple of days. So we do things like that, and then if there's conferences, we'll go places for conferences, and then we'll do travel to our customers. Usually it's Google customers. So the biggest user of Angular in the world is a group that does all the tooling for Google Cloud. So if you ever use Google Cloud, everything, all the admin screens and everything are written in Angular. And that team's mostly up in Seattle. So we'll do trips up there. Some of the team is over in Europe, so we'll do trips over there sometimes. Cool. Yeah.
So are you from Portland, Oregon?
Oh, so I travel more than most.
Yeah.
I live in Milwaukee.
Oh.
Yeah, real close to here. I fly to Mountain View. I flew here this morning from Mountain View, and I usually go back on Monday. I'll travel down on Monday or Tuesday. I'll come back here on Thursday or Friday.
So you
I
have
commute
a
to
place.
Yeah, down there.
You have a place like an apartment or something that you stay at.
Yeah.
So I understand that there is an office here. Do you
Yes,
know,
I was at the office earlier today.
Do you know what work is being done there, or is that classified?
I don't think I wouldn't say it's classified. I don't, but I wouldn't say anything that I don't know that isn't. It's just I could say it's a relatively small office as far as Google. I think it's only like 60 or 70 people, and they're not working on something that I want to do. So I'm not in that office. Like, otherwise, I mean, there's a big culture of like move to a team. If you find something you're interested in at Google, it's very easy to transfer teams, right? It's somewhat encouraged so that you get a wide breadth of knowledge by transferring teams, and you don't have to go leave Google and work somewhere else to do what you want to do. But yeah, they don't have anything I'm interested in there. So.
Okay, Jason, so now you have worked on this role for about 2 years.
Yeah.
What's next? Are you going to?
So for me, before I started Google, I was making my living developing with Angular, and now I'm on the team that develops Angular. I am very happy with this current team because in order to, your question about Vue and React and all these other frameworks, like Angular's not perfect. Like there were some mistakes made when this version of Angular first came out, and we know that there were mistakes. There's a lot of stuff to fix, so there's a ton of new stuff. It's constantly a very new frontier, at least for now. Maybe at some point it won't be, but I don't know. Like I didn't come to this team knowing how to perfectly optimize the function definition for the V8 runtime, right? Like for the thing that runs JavaScript code in Chrome. There's a lot to learn about things like that when you're on a framework. You have to learn new things like that, like how to optimize for things that you never had to before. So for me, there's still a bunch of stuff. I think there's a bit of a runway before I'll go somewhere else. Yeah.
So you said that you've tried, I guess, experimentally some other things, maybe on your own time or something. Can you tell us about any of that?
So the first one that when I did the evaluation of frameworks a while ago, that was back in the day when there was the big debate over Backbone or Angular. JS.
Absolutely.
Remember that? Yeah. So that was back then. And at the time I had used EXT.js, which is now Sencha. I'd used JavaScript MVC, and I'd used a small host of others. One of the ones that we evaluated at the time was Knockout. We also looked at Ember. Ember was really early at that point.
Dojo?
Dojo was on the list. I don't remember why we eliminated Dojo quickly. Dojo was on that list of 22 back then.
It was going out at that point.
Yeah, I think it was going out already. So, and nowadays, like one of the jobs of being on a framework is to evaluate others and try to see, hey, what are they doing well that we're not doing? So I end up writing a decent amount of React code and Vue code, and just to like try out things. So, yeah.
That's sort of what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about your experiences with diversity and inclusion in Google?
I can. So that's a good question. Do you want to ask any specific question or just in general? Is it super general?
I think I'm really just wanting to know more about your experience and your perspective
Okay.
of what you experienced there with your program.
Okay. So Google makes a pretty big effort that you definitely notice as an employee to make sure that there is diversity and inclusion. And for Google, it starts with the funnel by which, from which they hire people, right? So if you are a minority, or you're a woman, or anything that could be any group, maybe handicapped, you will not get preferential treatment on the hiring side, right? You will not get an easier time going through the hiring process. However, what they will do is they'll target that target those people as a demographic to make sure that that enough people from those different areas come into Google and start the hiring process, right? I don't remember exactly what the numbers are in terms of, say, women in tech, but there's a certain percentage, and if
Less than 50.
well, very very much less than 50.
Yeah.
Yes, very much less than 50. and you know, Google has a lot of programs to encourage women to go into tech, and they'll do, you know, lectures at schools and high schools and colleges and universities to you know, increase the size of the funnel coming in. So they do that, and then in terms of, you know, sort of the day-to-day, it's a pretty I think it's a pretty diverse group. You know, when I first started, I was in Fiverr. I was working with 2 Indian gentlemen, 3 Chinese, 2 Chinese women, 2 Chinese men. My manager was a French guy. Another person I worked with was from one of the Polynesian islands somewhere. You know, it was a pretty good mix on that one. On the current project, you know, there's Eastern European guys, there's some guys from the U.S., and there's some amazing women developers on our team who are sort of driving the new stuff that we're coming out with right now, which is pretty cool. So I would say it's pretty good. I would say that Google would always want to improve, you know, diversity and inclusion, and there are, you know, there's classes that you can go to at Google to, you know, look at things that could improve diversity and inclusion, you know, on your team as like a manager, for instance. Yeah.
20%.
20% women in tech.
August 2017, 20% engineers are women.
Yeah.
Google.
At Google. Yeah. Which I don't know if that's higher or lower than the industry than the actual number in the industry, right? But
So driving to promote diversity is one of the things that Google and you guys are trying to improve on. Anything else that sort of is, that in your experience could be improved, or?
oh yeah, there's always stuff. Definitely stuff that can be improved. Give you an example. Who remembers when Google came out with Allo? Anybody used Allo?
Yeah, Google Allo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
Which one's Allo and which one's Duo?
Well,
Allo, one of them does
Allo is
video
the one
stuff.
texting, and Duo you can do like FaceTime, look like iPhone.
Yeah.
And
what does Hangouts do?
They queue the Hangout.
Sort of.
Yeah.
But it's kind of still around.
Yeah, still around.
Okay.
I wish they can combine both of them together.
Yeah, and then there's this new thing, chat.hangouts.com or something like that as well. Anyway,
Yeah.
there's too many. Like, this is one thing. Like, come on, guys. Like, really? Are we? You know, why do we have to come up with so many different products and just put them out there? One of those is now dying. I forget which one it is. Right? Not the video one. The other one, the one that they came out with for chat, and it's sort of being integrated into some other products, but they're spinning it down. So I think sometimes the product, the selection of what to work on might be a little bit off, right? One of the kind of cool things at Google is they have a meeting every week on Thursday. It's called TGIF. It used to be on Friday. It's now Thursday because it's for an international audience, right? But at TGIF, Larry and Sergey and Sundar, you know, YouTube execs and execs from all across Alphabet, will get up and talk about the new things that came out, you know, this week or that are being worked on. And usually they'll do a deep dive on one particular thing. Maybe it's like self-driving cars one week, and you know, the Waymo guys will come up and talk about that project, or you know, new things at YouTube. Googlers are they're not bashful about asking really hard questions in that meeting. It's, you know, I'll ask questions in a setting, but in that setting, sometimes these questions are just, you know, really, really tough. If you remember when the James Damore thing happened, he was the guy that was let go after he came out with a pretty, certain pieces of his memorandum were pretty bad against women in tech specifically, and he would be very difficult to work with at Google because he basically considered that women were inferior in terms of their thought process and couldn't contribute to things like meetings. So he can't really be worked with. So he was let go, right? So you can imagine some of the questions that you might ask like a friend or arguments that you might have with somebody about something like that, and then imagine those questions being asked in front of a 70,000 person company, who's all watching these questions. Some of these questions are very tough, but they get up there every week and answer them, and some of the improvements happen because of that, right? If there's a bunch of people that are asking the same question, questions get voted on by Googlers as well, then it'll be something to take a look at.
So there's a channel to address.
Very much a channel to address that stuff. Yeah.
How would one go about getting a job at Google?
That's a good question. So there is a careers.google.com, I think, something like that, where it lists all the publicly available jobs. Yeah. And for me, it was LinkedIn. Honestly, just they reached out on the LinkedIn profile. But it's always good to if you want to get a job at Google, go look at that site. And they're pretty good about, they'll do the couple of phone screening interviews, and then they'll give you a lot of stuff to study. I think if you want to go for a job at one of these big tech companies, they kind of all interview the same way now. And there's a book, Cracking the Coding Interview. And when you go to Google, they'll say, go buy this book and do a lot of practice from it, right? And it in there describes the process for Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Netflix, and a few others. And really, they're all kind of a very similar process, Facebook. So people recommend spending about 12 months before the interview process of somewhat regular, you don't have to spend full time, just, in some off time, spend a few hours each week for about a year beforehand prepping for it. I don't know that it necessarily needs that much time, but I would say give it a couple of months, to prep for the interview. They will not, at least at Google, if you're like accepted to an on-site interview and you don't make it, a huge percentage of people that started at Google did not make it the first time. Very large percentage. So they have a very big, very open door policy. Come back in 10 months from now, go work on this stuff and come back in 10 months and come do another interview. A lot of the companies do because it's somewhere on the order of, I think, 1,300 or 1,400 applicants to one hire. So they have to have an open door. They have to have an open door policy. They can't just permanently reject people. Right? There'll be no people left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is Google going to take over the world?
I saw one slide on something somewhere that said, if Google continues the accelerated hiring practice, by 2023, they'll hire everybody in the world.
I think right now there are many big companies, not Google, like Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft.
Yeah, Google's not actually as big as some of the. Google's only like 70-something thousand people.
Yeah,
I mean,
there are a lot of big companies.
compared to companies like
Microsoft.
Yeah, Nike. Companies with a lot of employees. Google's very heavy on the software engineering side.
Yeah.
So in terms of that, they're probably on par with a lot of the other companies. But like Apple has a lot of retail employees too, right?
Apple.
And like warehouses and stuff. So
Amazon.
Amazon has the same, right? And that increases the count considerably. And then you go to like airlines, and airlines will be 150,000 employees, way bigger.
Or you can count Walmart.
Or you count, yeah, exactly.
The
Yeah.
most, in the US.
Yeah.
Even Caltech,
Yeah, we were briefly talking about the chat apps. Hangout,
Hangout.
chat, or a few like chat apps developed by Google. So I think I want to ask about the product like development, competitiveness within the organization. Say, for example, if your team already have a Hangout, I have an idea. I think I have a better chat app, but in that way I'm gonna compete with you. So then how do you? Probably that's not the case for Angular, but in Google for other teams, how do they handle it? And also, if there's one single good project, do you fight for that? I want that.
No, they don't. If it's a major supported item like Hangouts or Gmail or something, right? If there's some really good idea, remember Inbox, right? Inbox was done even though Gmail was out there. Well, they had a different paradigm. They wanted to take a different spin on email handling, right? Their spin was, I think, zero out your inbox and categorize things a little bit better than Gmail. Now Inbox is going away and it's sort of migrating back into Gmail. All the learnings from Inbox are going back into Gmail, right? So they don't necessarily say you cannot have a competing product. It would have to have some compelling reason to come up with something totally new. And because the source code is available to everybody at Google, I could borrow your source code. I could say, oh, well, he's got some really great data services. Let me just put a new front-end layer on top of this thing that the other project already made, right? Yeah.
Have you discussed the 80-20 sort of like, work?
Okay, yeah, so we should probably end up, maybe this will be the last question, but 80-20. So the idea at Google would be that you can spend 20% of your working time on a project of your choosing. So that can be done in a number of different ways. It can be done one day out of every week. You could do it, effectively 2 months out of the year, 2.5, whatever. You can kind of build up that time if you want. If you want to not use it for 2 years and you want to go work, Google has an internal sort of startup group, and if you want to go spend 6 months on a startup, and you've built up some of that time, go ahead. So the idea is really, if you have an interest in something, maybe you're passionate about something. One of the people that's on our team started that way. He was in customer support, or he was in internal Googler support, and he was really interested in working on the Angular team. So he took his 20% time, and he told his manager, "I'm going to go work on the Angular project for 1 day out of every week." And he took his work time to do it, and then he eventually transitioned onto the team. So there's a lot of people that you can do that. It's pretty open to allow you to do that, as long as your other stuff is getting done, right? When that performance review comes, if you didn't get anything done on your main project and you did great on your 20% time, that's not going to look so good. So, yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank
I think
Jason,
we're all set.
There is still more pizza, so feel free to grab some on your way out the door.
Time, is that sort of concretely accruing like vacation hours would, or just,
I have seen a system that tracks it, and so I think you can track it that way. If I were to do 20% time, it would be on Angular anyway, so I don't do it. Yeah,
You
but
wouldn't want to work on a Delphi project? Right?
no, yeah, exactly.
I've never even heard of Delphi
Oh, really?
before today.
Yes. It's not like it's a bad language. It's just antiquated, very antiquated at this point. It was written by the guy. It was originally written by the guy who has later wrote C# and TypeScript.
So
Anders.
do you know if he was working on those kinds of ideas when he wrote Delphi? Because a lot of times people are developing ideas and they'll write something. They'll build something that's sort of an intermediate, help me flesh this idea out thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was earlier on in his career, right? And so he learned a lot by writing Delphi. And a lot of people use Delphi for some really, really good projects. It was popular for a long time. And then moved to Microsoft. Yeah.
So I might reach out to him on LinkedIn. Just want to introduce
Yeah.
Aaron
Aaron?
Levine. Yeah.
Okay.